morning. Well, today I'm down here. We're finally kind of caught up a little bit on the cattle with respect to the bulls all out, and they've been doing their thing for a little while now. And so we're just going to talk just a little bit today about, and I've told y'all before, on our operation, when I talk about something, I'm talking about how we do it and what's helped us. It may mean nothing to somebody else that it's not applicable to. But for somebody that's in our area or has similar habitat as we do, it may just be that thing that just puts them in a better position. So we're going to talk about some things that we've done that have really helped us. Let me get the dogs fed real quick, and then we'll get started on that. So what I want to talk about, at least for our operation, in hopes that it maybe helps somebody, is enterprise stacking. And some of y'all have probably heard that before. And I don't know, my dad introduced it to me. He was introduced to it through ranching for profit, I believe, years ago. And it gives you the ability to track enterprises that you may want to start. For example, for us, the goat enterprise, kind of utilizing your same assets. So your overhead may stay about the same. You're going to have some direct costs that increase, and those will be applied directly to the enterprise. But it's another way of diversifying income and diversifying risk. So the example that I'm going to talk about right here is our goats, and you've heard me talk about that before. Before we did goats, we started looking at our resources that we have, not what resources could we add, but resources that we already had that weren't being utilized or fully utilized. And it matched perfectly with the goats. So then we had to get together and think about, if it was something that was going to, we had the resource, so we weren't going to spend any more money as far as feed and things like that. So we had to think about our direct costs that were going to be applied with that enterprise, and that was going to be fencing, it was going to be guard dogs. Here, or come here, yeah. It was going to be let's just stick to the nanny side of it right now. So the nannies having babies and us immediately selling the babies. There weren't any other great big costs that I can. Pens. There was going to be some capital expense on pens and a holding system as far as working the goats. And so we had those, and we had to put all those numbers in and look at our initial investment, and that was going to be on a borrowed thing. And that's how you want to calculate that. Even if you have the money stacked up, you're going to be losing interest on that money. So you want to make sure that you treat it as a borrow, even if you're borrowing it from yourself. So you need to charge a little interest of that. One of the things I forgot to mention was, yes, I mentioned the fencing that needed to be for the goats, but actually when I calculated that, I was also putting in there fencing where I needed fence for the cows also. It's just I added an extra wire and an extra clip, and of course the insulators and all that stuff to make it applicable for the goats also. So I kind of had a double whammy there as far as cost, because I needed it for the cattle also. Likewise, the water points, the water tubs and the floats and all of that stuff, other than bringing a few blocks down here, and I think those were $4 or $5 for the babies to kind of get up where they could get a drink, and I put some in the tubs and then some out of the tubs. Other than that, I utilize the same watering points. So that's not an excess cost as far as the goats and the cattle. So anything that utilizes water and fencing Think about that. But you go through all those numbers, do your numbers, and if it makes sense, which it did for us, you can start on it, or you can start putting it together. Now, your initial analysis is only as good as your estimates on your expense and your profit, and then obviously adjustments need to be made throughout the years, especially in agriculture. But what it does is, if you have the resource like we've talked about before and it's being underutilized, and you can get something in there that's utilizing it, it should bring extra money. But one thing that we don't talk about a lot that it does is it decreases risk on your entire operation. By that I mean for example, we had cattle when we started, so our cattle, we typically will, not typically, we always try to figure our cash flows on a market value, not on a private treaty value, or for example, selling to somebody individually. So we always try to calculate it on, if we hold them to the sale, what would we get? And so as the markets fluctuate, if you've ever watched that, usually when the cattle markets go down, the sheep and goats kind of go up. So because of that, if you've got a little bit in each side, that'll diversify your risk. It'll reduce your risk a little bit. Now, are the goats going to make as much as the cattle? Depends on how many you have. Depends on your resource. Depends on all that stuff. With our resource we have for goats, which we've never utilized until we just started getting these, it should do very well. It should compete, if not surpass, cattle. So that is an example of one way that we diversify our risk while not increasing our overhead. And I already mentioned there was a few capital expenses that we had to do, and you've just, like us, you've got to calculate that in and see, how quick is it going to be that you have those paid off, and then you're generating profit. Now, throughout all this stuff, I already said this is for us. I'm just talking about for us, nobody else. If it sparks an idea in somebody else, that's great. Do your research, do your due diligence. Don't just bail off in there and start doing it and thinking you're gonna add more money to your operation. So some of y'all know we also have a hunting operation, and it is another risk reducer. It is another income diversification, and obviously another enterprise. It's going to have its own direct costs. They're all going to have a certain amount of the overhead. We have four-wheelers that we use in all the operations. We have trucks that we use in all the operations. We have the main asset, which is the land, that is encompassed in all the operations. So all of that will stay the same. And so it's another income that's not even really linked to agriculture. So another way to diversify our risk. So the wildlife is another excellent opportunity that a lot of people in the livestock industry have, especially if they own land or if they lease land or something like that. It's another way to generate a little more income. Not only is it good to have diversification, these kind of go hand in hand, what I'm about to say, is to have diversification in your enterprises. It also holds true to have diversification in your plants or your habitat. You'll see that we've got forbs. When it's hot and heavy native grass season, we'll have native grass everywhere. We'll have clovers. There's always, it seems like, something growing here unless we're in a severe drought. And so we don't ever waste any money on trying to control. Got to be careful how I say this, because we have if there's too much of any one thing, and I should say consistently, in other words, I'm thinking of the locust trees, and I'm sitting here looking at locusts as we're talking, but if there's too much of any one thing consistently, then you may have to do something. What we did was we cut some with the skid steer, and then we utilized the goats to go in and eat the seedlings when they come back. And that's a twofer. And they love it. The goats absolutely love it. So there's lots of things that you can do. Don't close your mind, and we've never closed our mind to an enterprise that might fit us. When my son was here, there was a couple of 2 or 3 years in there that he raised crawfish. Well, if you've seen the water that we have on this place sometimes, you can understand that. At that moment in time, that was a pretty good enterprise for him. And they were delicious. You know, you see a lot of people that and homesteaders are the best at this. A lot of people, they'll have livestock guardian dogs and they'll sell pups. Well, that's an additional enterprise. It doesn't really cost them a whole lot more as far as they'll have some direct cost in the pups and maybe some vet bills, but that's kind of it. And those are the things that I'm talking about, and the things that we like to look at while we're doing things on our place. You know, one thing I forgot to mention was that we will also break up our enterprises on, like, our cow-calf. We utilize retaining the calves and growing them for another, you know, really for the summer sometimes, as a stocker program. So what that means is whenever we wean them off the cows and we throw them over into the stocker program, that's a different enterprise. Our accounting is set up where we immediately start tracking that, as far as at the time we moved them from the cows to the stocker, we give them a price, whatever the market price is. And that's what the stocker operation had to pay to get them in there. Now, is there any money that exchanges hands? No. But it gives us a long-term outlook on is that a good way to do that. And the way that we use it is it's when we have extra forage. So it's kind of like a clutch that we have with our resource as far as grass resource for the cattle. If we have extra forage, then we retain the calves. We utilize that forage during the growing season, which is when it would need to be utilized, especially the first part of the growing season. And then we'll get rid of them. And at the same time, we'll track that to see if it actually made money. If it didn't make money over, you know, several years of calculating, you know, it doesn't make any sense to do it. Doesn't make any sense unless you have another thing that you're doing with them at the end. And it's the same way with the goats. When we pull those goats off and they weigh 45 pounds and we throw them into a finishing program, like I've been doing the last 3 years, I think. And so I'll take them on up to 60. And so we'll do the same thing. What will they bring at 45 pounds when we pull them off? What's it going to cost us, and what will they bring at the end of the 60 days that we feed them? So it's just a nice way to track it. And I'm not touting any accounting software, but if you have an accounting software that you can assign a class to it, you can assign cow stalkers, you can assign goat stalkers, you can assign goat nannies, cow calf, wildlife, you know, whitetail, pig, turkey, ducks, whatever you want to do, but you can track all that stuff. And because they all utilize the overhead, don't even worry about the overhead. You're going to have that same overhead even if you don't do any of those other enterprises. If your main enterprise is cattle, you're still going to have the same overhead with the other stuff, excluding the direct cost or the capital costs that come with the enterprise. and you need to calculate that before you get started on it. That's what we did. So anyway, it's livestock and agriculture is amazing, the opportunities that are there. And you know, when we were doing stuff with Bud, he would always say, you know, that he thought agriculture was one of the best businesses for a young person to get into right now because there were so many opportunities. And that's hard to say because, I mean, it's tight. When you start thinking about land cost and what they've done, especially in our area, the land has just absolutely exploded. And I don't know that it could even be done unless you could lease it from somebody. But it would be very difficult with our current land costs where we are. But that doesn't mean there's not land costs that it might work on somewhere else in the country. So there's just a lot of opportunity. Don't ever close your mind if you're trying to make it work. Don't ever close your mind to another enterprise. Now, I will say there's a point in there where you've heard the adage of if you focus on one thing, you'll do real well at it, but if you focus on more than one thing, you won't, basically. I don't necessarily agree with that in this business. And I guess it's because they're all so interrelated, and because they help offset some mistakes, maybe, or some trials and tribulations that you have with one enterprise. The other enterprise may help it. You know, when the prices go down, when there's a drought. We've got some friends in Australia, and they had severe, of course, they're always in drought over there. They don't think they are because it's all relative, but severe drought hit, and they got rid of their cattle, all of them. And so you're like, well, what are they going to do? Well, they went back with goats. It was my dad that was talking to him. And, he said, well, how's that going to work? And he said, that's working good. And, well, how many goats is it taking to keep going? Well, 11,000 goats. God. Holy smoke. Can you imagine 11,000 goats? Yeah. But his mind is open. Everything was wide open to whatever needs to be done to make it work. And what can be done. And so when you go out and you look at your pasture and you see a bunch of weeds, or you see, don't just go get the mower and start mowing them. Think about it. Think about what's going on. It's real hard to kind of see what's going on unless you kind of let them go for a little while and watch what happens. For example, what happens a lot here, there again, this is our place. What happens a lot here is the goats will utilize the weeds mainly in the dormant season. But on areas where I'm not running the goats yet, the weeds protect the grass during the growing season. So what does that mean? Do they protect it, or do they prevent the cows from utilizing it? Well, both. That basically is letting me stockpile forage without having to build multiple fences or rest pastures, adjust things so I can rest a pasture here and rest a pasture there and rest a pasture there. Now I'll still do that sometimes because of the flood. But I really noticed how the cattle, they don't necessarily want to go in there and eat where all the weeds are, even though there's gobs of grass underneath them. When it gets real hot and the wind's blowing and all that stuff, the weeds are providing a little bit of shade. And that grass under there has done really well. I've really paid attention to that this year, and it was way better than the grass where there's not any weeds. And so the cattle don't want to go in there. They don't want to They're lazy, just like us. They don't want to go in there and have to dig around there to get to the grass until the dormant season. And then they're like, hey, yeah, there's some good stuff in there. And there is. And we utilize it. So don't just knee-jerk something when it potentially has a benefit that you've overlooked. Anyway, any of you guys that have seen some other benefits of things that a lot of people will spend money battling, drop a comment. I'd love to see it. I know somebody's going to have a benefit of the locust. I know one benefit of the locust. That's why I say when you get too many, I want to have some locusts, because when they drop those beans, man, that'll feed goats. It's like feeding them soybeans. There's a beat up head right there, and a sore foot. What you get for fighting, little man?
He said, shut up, don't bother me. Don't bother me, I'm eating my beans.
Yeah, there you go. Man, sometimes I hate the deer season. This is so irritating right here. You know, what did I do to them? Obviously, I'm missing some fence somewhere. God. They start rubbing, and they rub on everything. So anyway, track your enterprises. Don't ever not look at new enterprises if it makes sense without, well, do your due diligence, do your research. If it makes sense, you might look at it. You are going to have the same asset as far as your land, as far as your pickup, as far as your four-wheeler. You had guard dogs and you wanted to go to sheep, it's not going to change your guard dogs. You're going to have the same asset. So that's what I wanted to kind of cover today, and I really appreciate you watching, and I hope it gets some of y'all thinking, not thinking about doing exactly what we do because we do it, but thinking about maybe some additional things that you could do that might help the bottom line. At least just not overlook them. So thanks again, and we will see you next time.